Chapter 7 of the book Tribal Church is entitled Generation Tribes. You know, when our church was started back in 1979, it was started by 7 families that met in a bait house on the shores of Lake Ray Hubbard. And those 7 families were primarily made up of the generation that's known as the Builders, an older generation. But they had a vision of starting a church where the baby boomers, my generation, would feel welcome. And that's exactly what we did. And we had the luxury for many years of really focusing in on one generation, the boomer generation. But as time went on, other generations came, and we realized that we had multiple generations in our church. And over the years, different churches have addressed that multi-generational challenge in different ways. There are some churches like Willow Creek Church that created a church within the church. Some of you are familiar with the Axis ministry that Willow had at one time. And that was a church that was subject to the same elder board, but it was a sub-ministry, kind of like youth ministry or children's ministry. It was one church, but it was had a different church service, it had a different worship team, it had a different style. Now later on in the history of that particular ministry, they decided to do away with that church within the church and to blend those again, but that's one way to approach that issue. Another church that did that was a Bible church in Alexander, Virginia, McLean Bible Church. And they created something called Frontline. And again, it was a church within a church. And they had a church for 20s and 30-something that met at a different time. They met in the same building, but they met at night. And so that's one way to approach it. Another way to approach that particular issue is for a church to go out and start a separate new church to relate to a new generation. And in a sense, that's what First Baptist Church Rockwall, our mother church, did when they planted us. They were primarily a church made up of the builder generation. And they felt, for whatever reason, that they wouldn't do a very effective job reaching the baby boomers. So they just went out and started a church for baby boomers. And they called me at that time, a 26-year-old seminary student who was a baby boomer, to lead that. Now, we've taken a little bit of a different track on how to reach the different generations. We believe that it's important for those generations to learn to worship together and to share their worship services. And so as the younger generation has come along, those of us who are boomers in our church, we've decided not to start a church for the next generation within our church, and we've decided not to go out and plant a church that is a one-generational church, but rather to slowly evolve our service and to lean toward that next generation in terms of our technology, in terms of our style. Now, there's not a right or wrong way to do that, but it's important that all of us recognize that in every church there are multiple generations. And the question is, how are you going to best relate to those multiple generations? Now, we've had a new recent development, and that is that we realized that we had a larger and larger number of builders in our church that loved everything about our church, but really, to be honest, tolerated our music. And when that group got large enough, we have now offered what we call a classic service for them. They hear the same message that the rest of our church does. They meet in the same building, but they actually go to worship, and they have a traditional choir and a traditional orchestra. And so what we've done is we have, in fact, created a church within a church for an older generation. You say, well, Steve, why would you do that with an older generation, but you're not doing that with the younger generation? Part of it is that there's a lot more difference between the builder generation and the boomer generation than there is the boomer generation and the succeeding generations. I don't listen to the same radio station that my dad does, but I'm fairly comfortable listening to the same radio station that my kids do. And so every situation is different, but we must be aware of the fact that there are multiple tribes that are generational.